It was a cold Sunday morning when my father and I arrived at our family's farm. I had always loved this place, not because of the farmland itself, but because of the dense forest that lay just beyond the property. Ever since I was a kid, I found something peaceful about wandering between those towering trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, painting the ground in shifting patterns. But the real reason I loved the farm? My dog, Molly. She was a mutt, big enough to be a good guard dog, but sweet as could be. I felt safer with her by my side, and she loved our forest walks just as much as I did. My father assumed I just walked her along the gravel roads near the farm, but I always ventured deeper into the woods where the trees swallowed the noise of the world. There, it felt like nothing bad could ever happen. That morning, I did what I always did. After hugging Molly, despite my parents' warnings that I'd end up smelling like her all day, I clipped on her leash and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He nodded absent-mindedly, already focused on fixing some equipment in the garage. As soon as we reached the tree line, I unclipped Molly's leash and let her run ahead. She bounded through the undergrowth, tail wagging, nose to the ground as she tracked scents I couldn't detect. Meanwhile, I entertained myself in my usual way, carving my initials into tree bark with my pocket knife and smacking rocks with a piece of what I'd found, pretending I was playing baseball. I was mid-swing when I heard Molly bark. At first, I ignored it. She always barked at squirrels, foxes, and anything that moved. But then she barked again, louder, sharper, more aggressive. Something was wrong. I gripped the wooden stick like a weapon and called out, "Molly, get back here." No response. A chill ran down my spine. She always came when I called. Always. I followed the sound of her barking, pushing through the underbrush, my heart pounding a little harder with each step. When I finally reached her, I froze. Molly was standing rigid, hackles raised, teeth bared. She wasn't looking at an animal. She was staring at a man. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, and he was shirtless despite the morning chill. His skin was pale and covered in dirt, and his gray beard was matted, giving him the look of someone who hadn't seen civilization in years. In one hand, he clutched a rusted machete, the blade dull but heavy-looking. In the other, he held a glass bottle of something amber-colored, moonshine, if I had to guess. But the strangest thing? He wasn't looking at me. He was hacking at the ground. Hard. Over and over again. Like he was trying to carve his way to the center of the earth. Molly's barks didn't even faze him. My voice came out shakier than I wanted. "Sir, are you okay?" Slowly, the man turned to face me. His eyes were an unsettling shade of blue, icy and unblinking, wide with either madness or excitement. The intensity of his stare made my skin crawl. He licked his cracked lips. "Come here, boy. Look what I've dug up." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something about the way he said it made my curiosity override my fear. I stepped forward, staying just outside of arm's reach. I peered down into the hole. Nothing. Just loose dirt and scattered rocks. Confused, I looked back at him. "I don't see." He turned back to the hole, dropped to his knees, and plunged his hands into the dirt like an animal. Then, to my absolute horror, he emerged with a bone clamped between his teeth. I couldn't tell what kind of bone it was. Too large for a small animal, too thick for a bird. Something about the way he looked at me, like a child showing off a prize, made my stomach twist. That was enough. I grabbed Molly's collar, yanking her back as I slowly stepped away. The man didn't move at first, just stood there, chewing absent-mindedly on the bone like a dog with a treat. Then, suddenly, he grinned. It was the most unsettling smile I had ever seen. He lifted the machete, resting it against his shoulder. "You leaving already?" I didn't answer. I just kept walking backward. The moment I turned, I heard a sharp whistle, high-pitched, almost like a signal. Then, before I could even process what was happening, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Something flying toward me. I ducked. The machete whizzed past my head, embedding itself in a nearby tree with a heavy thunk. And then he laughed. A deep, rasping sound, like he was genuinely enjoying himself. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I grabbed Molly and ran. I didn't care that the branches cut at my arms or that my legs were burning from the sprint. I didn't care that I nearly tripped half a dozen times. All I cared about was getting out of that forest. Behind me, I could still hear him laughing. It echoed through the trees, fading in and out, like he was everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time I burst out of the woods and into the open farmland, I was gasping for air. My father was still in the garage, fiddling with the tractor lights. He barely glanced up as I collapsed against the side of the building, my chest heaving. I thought about telling him. I wanted to tell him, but I knew what he'd say. He'd tell me I imagined it, that it was some homeless guy, some drunk hermit living off the land, that I was exaggerating, and worst of all, that I wasn't allowed to take Molly into the woods anymore. So I said nothing. I kept the secret to myself, but I never went into that forest alone again. The strangest part? A few months later, a news story broke about a shallow grave discovered deep in the woods near our farm. Authorities found several human remains, some of them decades old. They never caught the person responsible, but I already knew who it was, and I could still hear his laughter. In 2016, something strange was happening all over the world. Clowns. Not the fun, birthday party kind, but silent, eerie figures lurking on the edges of forests, standing by roadsides at night, staring at passing cars without moving. Some wielded weapons. Some chased people. Some just stood there, their painted grins unsettling enough on their own. It was like something out of a horror movie, but it was real. I never thought I'd see one in person. I was wrong. It was October, and a friend of mine was throwing a party deep in the woods near our town in the UK. A secluded bonfire, music, and drinks. It sounded like the perfect night. The only problem? I had to walk through the woods alone to get there. I wasn't too worried. It was only about a 10-minute walk from the main road, and I had been through those woods plenty of times before. The quickest route was a narrow path with no lights, but I had my phone's flashlight. By the time I reached the tree line, the sky was an inky black, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy. The air smelled like damp leaves and earth, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of branches and the crunch of my boots on the path. I turned on my flashlight and kept walking. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The wind had stopped, and even the occasional hoot of an owl had vanished. I tried not to let it bother me, but my pulse was picking up. Then I heard something. To my left, just beyond the trees, a rustling sound. I stopped, shining my flashlight in that direction. At first, I saw nothing. Just trees, shadows, and undergrowth. Then, I noticed a shape sitting on a fallen log about 20 feet away. I squinted, my heart thudding a little faster. It could have been a trick of the moonlight, the way the shadows played on the trees, but no. Someone was sitting there. I hesitated, then made the mistake of lifting my flashlight and shining it directly at them. The light revealed him in an instant. A clown. A man. Huge, sitting completely still, dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit. His face was painted white, with thick red lips that curled into an exaggerated smile. The moment my light hit his face, he didn't blink. He just sat there, smiling. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The rumors, the news stories, the blurry videos of clowns standing in the woods, they all came rushing back. And now I was standing in front of one. Alone. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back onto the path, keeping my flashlight trained on him. He didn't move. Maybe he was just some idiot trying to scare people. Maybe he wasn't dangerous. Maybe he was just sitting there for a laugh. Then I heard it. A faint chuckle. I swear to God, the clown laughed, softly, like he was trying to hold it in, but he couldn't help himself. I took another step back, and then he stood up. I turned and walked faster, heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled out my phone and tried to call someone, anyone. I dialed my friend's number. No signal. I tried another number. No answer. I could hear him now, his footsteps crunching behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I started jogging, pretending to talk on the phone. Hey, yeah, I'll be there soon. You guys are waiting at the entrance, right? I prayed that maybe, just maybe, if he thought I wasn't alone, he'd stop following me. Then I heard it. Faster footsteps. He was running. I broke into a sprint. My flashlight bounced wildly, the path barely visible ahead. I didn't care. I just ran, lungs burning, legs pumping, adrenaline surging through me. Up ahead, I saw the faint glow of the bonfire. I was close. So close. The sound of his footsteps was still there, pounding behind me. Then, I made a mistake. I turned my head. For a split second, I saw him, his massive frame barreling toward me, arms pumping, that horrifying grin still plastered on his painted face. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I ran faster. The path ahead had a barbed wire fence running alongside it. I didn't hesitate. I jumped. Pain tore through my hands as the barbed wire ripped into my skin, but I didn't stop. I tumbled onto the other side, scrambled to my feet, and kept running. When I turned back, the clown was standing on the other side of the fence, his chest heaving. He wasn't laughing anymore. He just stood there, watching me. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand and waved. I didn't stop running until I reached the party. When I stumbled into the clearing, my friends saw the blood on my hands and the wild look in my eyes. I must have looked insane. I tried to explain, tried to tell them what I had just seen, but as I spoke, the words felt ridiculous. A clown? In the woods? Some of them laughed. Some didn't believe me. A few of them went back down the path to check. They came back 15 minutes later, shaking their heads. Nobody was there. I didn't believe them. He was there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting. I never took that path again. And sometimes, when I walk home at night, I get that same feeling, that prickling awareness that someone, somewhere, is standing just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to step into the light and smile. I was 13 when it happened. At that age, I thought I was invincible. That bad things only happened in movies, to other people, in places far away from my quiet countryside town. I learned the hard way that I was wrong. It was the middle of the afternoon, bright, sunny, and completely normal. I had moved to a new neighborhood recently, one with barely any houses, just long stretches of empty road and miles of thick forest. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours and still feel lost in the endless green. I didn't mind. In fact, I loved it. My only real friend at the time was my dog, Henry, a huge black Labrador mix, strong, loyal, and intimidating enough that people always crossed the street when they saw us. He was my shadow, my guardian, and the only reason my parents let me wander so freely. That day, I decided to take him for a walk down a dirt trail that cut straight through the woods. It was a path used mostly by people riding motocross bikes, but I'd never seen anyone there before. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place I went to clear my mind. I should have listened to my gut when I heard the first distant rumble of an engine. It started off faint, just a distant growl carried by the wind. At first, I ignored it. The forest muffled sound strangely, and I figured the noise was coming from some road far away. But it got louder, closer. I turned back. A motorbike was coming fast. I stepped off the trail, tugging Henry with me, pressing against the trees to let the rider pass. That's when I saw him. The bike burst into view, kicking up dust and leaves as it tore down the path. The rider was dressed in all black, helmet covering his face, gloves gripping the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was coming right at me. I moved farther into the undergrowth, expecting him to just zoom past like any normal biker would. But he didn't. Instead, he slowed down. My stomach twisted. Henry growled, a deep, rumbling sound that usually made people back off immediately. The biker didn't even flinch. Instead, he stopped the bike completely and just sat there, staring at me through his tinted visor. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them. A strange, charged silence stretched between us. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine idling. Something about it felt wrong. Then he revved the engine. I flinched. Henry barked furiously. The man just sat there, watching. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and walked away, forcing myself to stay calm, to not break into a run. But the moment I moved, the bike moved too. I walked faster. The bike rolled forward, matching my pace. He was following me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance back. He tilted his head at me, like he was amused. That was it. I ran. Henry bolted beside me, his leash slipping from my hand as we raced through the forest, dodging trees, stumbling over roots, breath coming in short gasps. The roar of the engine exploded behind me. He was chasing me. I sprinted, lungs burning, vision blurring. The trail wasn't thick enough to lose him. He could still follow. But I knew something he didn't. The forest. I veered off the path, crashing into the trees, branches whipping against my face. Henry followed, bounding ahead, his black fur blending into the shadows. The engine cut out. For a second, I thought maybe he had given up. Then I heard the footsteps. Heavy, purposeful, getting closer. I clamped a hand over my mouth, pressing my back against a tree, trying to quiet my frantic breathing. The forest was dense here. If I stayed still, if I didn't make a sound, maybe. A branch snapped. I turned my head, heart hammering in my chest. He was right there, 10 feet away, standing just at the edge of the trees, helmet still on, body tense, as if he was listening. I could see his chest rising and falling under his jacket. He was waiting. Henry let out a low growl from somewhere deeper in the trees. The biker turned his head sharply, listening. Another growl, closer this time. Then, before I even knew what was happening, Henry lunged out of the bushes, teeth bared. The biker stumbled back. He hadn't expected that. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches clawing at my arms, my legs screaming in protest. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. A house. I saw it through the trees. A small, unfinished house under construction, its wooden frame exposed, walls half-built. I dove behind the fence, dropping to my hands and knees in the dirt. Silence. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe through my nose, my ears straining for any sign of him. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then, footsteps. He was looking for me. I pressed myself against the wooden beams, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, the footsteps faded. I waited 30 minutes, maybe more. Long enough that my body started to cramp from crouching. Finally, I dared to move. Henry found me first, his tongue lolling, tail wagging, as if nothing had happened. I buried my face in his fur, relief flooding through me. I took the long way home. I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me. They thought I was exaggerating, that maybe some local kids were messing around. But I knew. Years later, I heard rumors, stories about hidden weed farms deep in the woods, guarded by people who didn't take kindly to strangers. People who watched the forests. People who had cameras. Maybe I had wandered too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he had been sent to chase me away. Or maybe he just liked the hunt. I always believed I was a cautious person. Sure, I took some risks, walking alone at night, cutting through dark alleys to get home faster, wandering into empty fields with just my dog for company, but I never felt unsafe. I trusted my instincts. Until that night. Until him. It was a warm evening, just before sunset. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and purple, the last light of the day stretching long shadows across the open fields. I had been walking my dog, Luna, a fluffy white retriever mix, through the countryside near my home. It was a peaceful spot, a place where I could let her off leash and just enjoy the solitude. I had been feeling, off that day, something small, like an itch in the back of my mind, a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way. Once, when I was a child, I had that same sensation right before my family's car nearly hit a deer in the middle of the night. A warning. I pushed the feeling aside and kept walking. The path I had to cut through a wide, open field, leading into a small stretch of woods that was a shortcut back home. It was a lesser-used path, but I had walked it countless times before. I could navigate it in my sleep. As I reached the entrance to the woods, I saw someone standing at the far end of the path. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a dark silhouette against the last light of the sky. But then I noticed something strange. He wasn't walking. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me. Luna, usually playful and curious, stopped as well. Her ears perked up, and a soft whine escaped her throat. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make sense of the figure in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a child. It looked small, hunched forward slightly. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a child. It was a man, a fully grown man, sitting awkwardly on a tiny boy's bicycle. His long, gangly legs barely fit the pedals. His knees jittered up awkwardly as he balanced on the too small frame. His head was completely bald, his skin pale in the fading light. But it was his face that sent a shiver down my spine. He was smiling. Not a normal smile. Too wide. Too eager. Like he had been waiting for me. A slow, nauseating feeling crept over me. I told myself to turn around, to take the long way home. But I didn't. Like an idiot, I kept walking. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to look scared. Maybe I thought if I ignored him, he would just stay there. But with each step I took, his head followed me. I was close enough now to see the details of his face, his wide, gleaming eyes, his teeth too white, too perfect. His hands gripped the handlebars so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white. And then, as if he couldn't contain his excitement anymore, he began to bounce on the bike. Up and down, up and down. His feet never left the pedals. He just bounced, his whole body shaking with barely contained energy. His grin stretched wider. I stopped in my tracks. Luna let out a low growl, her tail stiff. She sensed it too. Something wasn't right. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything but watch me. Then I saw it. A twitch. His fingers flexed on the handlebars. His body coiled slightly, like he was getting ready to move. A surge of panic shot through me. I turned around fast, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I forced myself to walk at a normal pace, even though my entire body screamed at me to run. I kept my head high. I didn't want him to know I was afraid. I glanced back once. He was still there, still smiling, still bouncing, but he wasn't following me. Relief washed over me. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe he was just some weird guy who liked riding small bikes for fun. I let out a breath and kept walking. Luna, however, was still tense. She kept glancing back, ears perked, her fur bristling. I reached the middle of the field, my house barely visible in the distance. I exhaled. Then, out of nowhere, Luna bolted. I barely had time to react before she tore off toward the trees, chasing something. "Luna!" I shouted, running after her. She never ran off like this. Something must have spooked her. I followed her across the grass, my heart pounding. And then, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A dark shape, racing toward me, on a bike. The man. He was pedaling through the uneven field, his legs pumping furiously, his entire body shaking as he rode toward me. But it didn't make sense. The ground was uneven, full of dips and holes. It should have been impossible for him to bike across it at that speed. But he didn't stop. His eyes were locked on me. His grin never wavered. I ran, harder than I had ever run in my life. I could hear the squeaking of his bike chain, the faint creak of the rusted frame as it lurched over the bumpy terrain. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. Luna reached me first, her tail tucked between her legs, her body pressed against mine. I whirled around. The man was still coming. Faster, faster. Then he crashed. His bike slammed into a deep ditch, the front wheel twisting violently. His body lurched forward, but he never let go of the handlebars. Even as he tumbled, even as he hit the dirt, he held onto the bike with inhuman strength. And then he started laughing. A horrible, shrill, breathless laughter, like a child who just heard a really funny joke. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed Luna's collar and ran the rest of the way home. That night, I locked every door, every window. I closed the blinds and sat on my bed, staring at the darkness outside. I never saw the man again, but sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I swear I hear a faint creaking sound, like the rusted frame of a bicycle rolling slowly through the grass. And when I turn, there's nothing there. But I always feel like someone is watching, and I can still see his grin in my mind. Too wide, too eager, like he's waiting. It started as a simple plan. A weekend in the woods. No work, no school, no stress. Just me and my two best friends, Jeff and Hunter, escaping into the quiet wilderness for a few days of camping. We wanted to get as far away from everything as possible, so we picked a secluded spot deep in the Arkansas woods, miles from any nearby roads or hiking trails. We brought our tent, some beer, and enough food to last us through the weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful, fun trip, but by the time we left, we were running for our lives. The first night was perfect. We found a clearing surrounded by towering trees and set up our camp. The sky was clear, the fire crackled warmly, and we laughed over stories while roasting burgers over the open flames. I remember thinking, this is exactly what I needed. Around midnight, the fire started to die down, and the night air turned cold. Hunter checked his phone. No signal. Not that we expected any, but it felt strange knowing we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Well, if we get murdered out here, no one's gonna find us, Hunter joked. Jeff smirked. That's why I brought this. He reached into his bag and pulled out a gun, a Glock, by the look of it. Hunter and I exchanged glances. Dude, you brought a gun? I asked. Jeff shrugged. Yeah, just in case. You never know. At the time, I figured it was overkill. Now, I realize it probably saved our lives. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up needing to take a leak. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the edge of our campsite. The forest beyond was pure darkness. As I stepped outside the tent, I heard footsteps. Not ours. Not an animal. Human. Close. I froze, my heart hammering. For a second, I thought I imagined it. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, a twig snapped. I wasn't alone. "Jeff," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Someone's out there." His expression hardened immediately. He reached for his bag, grabbing his gun, and sat up, listening. The footsteps got closer. Heavy. Deliberate. Hunter stirred awake. "What's going on?" Then, before any of us could react, 3 figures emerged from the trees. 3 men. I swear to God, they looked like they crawled straight out of a horror movie. Dirty, scraggly beards, clothes worn and ripped. They stared at us, their expressions unreadable. Then, the biggest one grinned. "All right, boys," he said, licking his lips. "Which one of y'all do we want?" I felt my stomach drop. The other 2 men chuckled. One of them pointed at Hunter. I like the blonde one. He looked soft. Hunter went pale. Jeff stood up, gun in hand. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you're going to turn around and walk away. Right now." The men didn't flinch. "Or what?" the big one said. "You going to shoot us?" Then, one of them stepped closer. I swear to God, the air felt thicker. My skin crawled. These weren't just random backwoods guys. There was something wrong with them. Jeff cocked the gun. "I'll put a hole in you so big they won't even find all the pieces." The men just laughed. And then one of them did something that turned my blood to ice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a duck call. He lifted it to his lips and blew. A shrill, eerie sound echoed through the trees. From deep in the woods, more footsteps answered. Hunter let out a choked breath. "There's more of them." My mind raced. Were they bluffing? Trying to scare us? Or was there really a group of these psychos surrounding our camp right now? I wasn't going to wait to find out. "Jeff," I whispered, "do something." Jeff raised the gun, took aim, and fired. The bullet hit the dirt near their feet. The 3 men jumped back, momentarily startled. "Run!" Jeff shouted. We didn't hesitate. We bolted. I heard them yell behind us, heard more movement in the woods, but I didn't look back. I ran like my life depended on it. Because it did. The forest was a blur. Branches tore at my arms. My legs burned. But I didn't stop. Jeff was ahead of me, leading the way. Hunter was behind, panting hard. I could hear the men chasing us. And then Hunter tripped. I skidded to a stop as he hit the ground, his glasses flying off into the dirt. "Get up," I hissed, grabbing his arm. He fumbled blindly, hands searching for his glasses. Footsteps. Close. Too close. Jeff turned back, raised his gun, and fired another shot. This time, I heard a scream. I didn't know if he hit someone, and I didn't care. Hunter grabbed his glasses, and we ran. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something through the trees, our car. It was still there, untouched. But the real question, would it start? I yanked the door open, barely able to breathe. Jeff jumped in the driver's seat, twisting the key. For one agonizing second, nothing. Then, the engine roared to life. Hunter slammed the door shut just as something burst from the trees, one of the men, running at full speed. Jeff floored the gas. The car shot forward. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the man standing in the road, watching us go. And behind him, shadows shifting between the trees. We didn't stop until we were miles away. Back in town, we sat in Jeff's apartment, shaken and silent. None of us wanted to admit how close we had come to whatever that was. I don't know who those men were. I don't know how many of them there were. But I do know this. They weren't just messing with us. They were hunting us. And if Jeff hadn't brought that gun, we might not have made it out at all. The next day, we checked online, searching for stories about weird encounters in those woods. Nothing. No reports. No warnings. No missing persons cases. Just empty land. Like they didn't want to be found. Like they were waiting for someone else to wander in. And I never want to know what happens when they catch someone who doesn't get away.